thank you very much. And first thing I would like to say, also on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Boris Cohen, I should send his warmest regards. Yes, he will do some post-army work today. We caught him running, and now then he's gone. And then there's a Jewish holiday today and tomorrow, so he couldn't come. But also on behalf of him, I would like to say thank you very much. Because as all of you know, it's not natural and it's not self-explanatory to cooperate and collaborate with Israeli institutions these days. So thank you very much. And to Joanna, especially a lot of thanks. And because thank you that you were so patient with me. Yes, and she did the how do you say, this mountain of work. So I don't want to be so long, so that we have maybe some 5 minutes before we start, that all of you can grab a coffee. So I can tell you a little bit about the idea of this workshop, because when we talked and met last year, the idea was maybe to do something together. And then the idea came up to do something on children's ego documents, because I think there's a lot on ego documents, and history is naturally most often written on the ego documents, experiences, self-testimonies of adults. But as I think some of you know, that I work since 20 years on children's experiences during and after the Holocaust. So both of you were very open to this. Yeah, and then I think because there is no research on this, so especially to look on this issue, not because I come from Holocaust research, not only to focus on the Holocaust years and the aftermath, but maybe to focus on the First World War and time after the Second World War. So, and I think so. I start my lecture now. However, over the past few decades, as you know, historians have only, let's say, in the 20 to 25 years, begun to reconsider these ego documents as relevant sources of historical scholarship. But if we bring, I think, children's perspectives and documentations and so on at the forefront, we gain, in my eyes, not only a richer and more inclusive understanding of history, but also insights into how children perceived, internalized, and responded to the world around them. This is very general. Unfortunately, I did not prepare a PowerPoint because I thought maybe this is for the speakers. And yeah, today we focus more on diaries, journals, letters, small notebooks, autobiographies and memoirs, but also drawings, and of course, maybe some of you, I'm not sure, but audio or video recordings. So why focus on children's ego documents? So this is one thing. The idea to give a voice to marginalized voices. As I said before, most often it is spoken about them, still until today, even though I think it changed a little bit in the last 20 years. When I started to research on my PhD on children in concentration camps, there was a bunch of testimonies from the Shoah Foundation and the Forschung of video archives, but most of the research was what happened to the children in the Holocaust, what was done to them. So it's more about understanding emotional worlds. So, for example, children's writings can provide rare insights into the emotional history of past societies, their fears, excitements, loneliness, wonder, trauma, and other topics. And I think we gain much more alternative worldviews because children naturally interpret the world around them different than adults. And as all of you know, one of the most I think the most popular or well-known type of an ego document in historical research is the Anne Frank's diary, which is iconic today, but on the other hand, you don't understand so much what was happening to the children in the camps, ghettos, in the killing sites, and so on. But I just heard some months ago, it was also very interesting, about children's letters during the Spanish Civil War. We have this, and I think we have some diaries from the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. So I cut this part a little bit. What we heard already from Joanna in the beginning and also from Igor, that these documents help historians reconstruct the texture of daily life, everyday life, what you did in the when you developed the school books, yes? They are in German and Polish, as I understand. Yes. Their place, and I was very much inspired, by the way, by the book George Eisen. He's a little bit forgotten, but it was Children and Play in the Holocaust. It was written, I think, in the end of 1980s, and so on. This was my first book on this issue. And I think also children's ego documents illuminate how emotions were learned or how they were hidden during the Holocaust years, taught and expressed. For example, how did children learn to suppress their emotions? What do they speak about? How did they perceive the adult world, which became like an enemy, and so on. And what I find also always challenging, but of course important, children may resist or subvert to adult ideologies in subtle ways. The documents can challenge dominant historical narratives or offer grassroots perspectives on events like, for example, war or displacement. I will give you an example in a few minutes from my actual research at Potsdam University. So to come to full circle, children's ego documents do more than add one perspective to history, as they restructure how we think about agency, memory, and narratives. And they challenge historical narratives. They show that children are not merely passive recipients or victims of adult decisions of war, but they actively took part in that history. So, and I give you now was very general. I think it's also interesting because I started my PhD okay. So, yes, I forgot something, sorry. I just wanted to check the time. But anyway, for my PhD, because when I started to research on my PhD, I was a little bit desperate because I found 1,000 secondary literature there was a lot in Polish, interesting, but I couldn't speak Polish. I just told it earlier to Joanna and Agnieszka. I tried to learn Polish, not very successful. I don't know why, but I don't know. And a lot in English, and a lot about Auschwitz and the Warsaw Ghetto and so on. But then, today it sounds natural, but when I started at the end of 2003, almost nobody researched with ego documents. I don't know why. I mean, even though there were these testimonies in the Shoah Foundation and in the Fortuna video archives, it was not a natural part of history. So I focused, one day I was I was wondering, how can I write about children in camps? Because the problem is I didn't want to dive all day in the mass killings, in how children were burned and killed and sent to the death chamber. So then I decided I will try to research on what do these, okay, they are adults, but how do they reflect on their childhoods? Why did they survive? What decisions did they make? I mean, it sounds so simple today and natural. It costs me a lot of headaches back then. So to make a long story short, what I found that they were forced to learn to behave like adults. And they have a special memory structures, how they remember the events of the Holocaust in the camps. And I give you now one example. So one crucial difference was that from adults is that the events of the Holocaust became part of the children's individual development. This was one finding of the children's psychologist Hans Carlsson. And I remember when I was in Israel for the first time in 2007, I met with, I didn't know that he was a child survivor, Otto Kulka. He wrote a lot about the Reichsrepresentations, Reichsvertretung, Reichsvereinigung. He published a lot of sources on the German Gestapo and especially on the Jewish responses and so on. And then I met him in Jerusalem, and a little time later he published his memories. No, and this was exactly the mistake. Until today I make this mistake. He published a book. It was called, in English, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death. And he was in Auschwitz-Birkenau with his father, Erich Kulka, and both spoke a lot about the children also in Birkenau. And then one day I wrote an email to him and said, Dear Otto, thank you a lot for the publication of your memories. It's really fascinating and so on. And then he was very angry with me because he said, these are not my memories. These are not my memories. It's not what I remember. Because, let me say where I found this email, yes. And he told me, and this I mean, it sounds easy, but it was really took me again headaches because I didn't quite understand it in the beginning. He said, okay, I have my historical work, I have the publication of the historical sources, but this is not, these are not my memories. He said, this is my extra academic work. Yes? And it's not memory, it's how I see the past, and I don't know. So I give an example from his book, and it's the representation of the color blue, which is closely connected to an emotion within Otto Kulka from this time, being a child in Auschwitz-Birkenau, that can, in my eyes, give an impression of how the experiences of childhood are closely associated with the camp, and how this experiences shaped him. It's not a memory, it's part of his worldview. And I quote now from his memories. It's a quote by Otto Kulka. So the color is blue, clear blue summer sky, silvery toy airplanes bringing greetings from distant worlds, move slowly through the sky as something that looks like white bubbles explores around them. The planes pass by, he was watching planes, and the sky remains blue and glorious. And when this boy, he speaks about himself, who now records this, asks himself, and he always asks himself, what was the most beautiful experience in the landscapes of your whole childhood? Where do you escape to in search of beauty and innocence? The answer is to that blue sky in Birkenau, and to the silver airplanes, those toys, and to the peace and silence that seemed to reign all around. For I absorbed that beauty and silence, and so they remained engraved in my memory. Beautiful, emotional childhood experiences, and end of quote. And for the rest of his life, to Kulka, this embodiment of a blue sky and silvery airplanes over Birkenau were, his, how did he call it? Yes, the embodiment of beauty beautiness, beautiful, and so on. I found this quite impressive. And so, to come to full circle, because we have only a little bit time, meanwhile, in the year 2025, the memories of Jewish child survivors, but also of non-Jewish children who survived forced labor, were deported from the Soviet Union and Poland. And I remember, I think it was 10 years ago that I gave this lecture here on the Germanization of Polish children, yes. There were not so many also testaments not accessible to me due to my lack of Polish, unfortunately. But meanwhile, they are a natural part of research on the Holocaust, National Socialism, and childhood experiences. So, and the next time when I dive deeper into memories of children, because I'm doing this work since 2004 now, with most of Jewish child survivors, was back then in, I have to say, 2023, after the Hamas-led massacres in the south of Israel, because my colleague Boaz and me, we were both shocked. He different than me, of course, because I was in a distance in Germany. And he was recruited, he is a reservist in the Israeli army. But then what was interesting, immediately on the 9th of October, the Israelis began to collect testimonies of people who survived in the kibbutzim, moshavim in the south of Israel. And until 1st or 2nd of December of 23, I went through all these testimonies in search what happened to the children. They didn't collect children's voices because today it's self-explanatory that you need psychologists to interview the children. You have to ask parents for permission and so on. It was different in the post-war period. Boaz worked on children's testimonies. So, but then I tried to collect and analyze everything what was written about what happened to the children. And our article was finalized on 15th of December. And it was interesting that in the beginning, nobody wanted to publish it because a German magazine, The Spiegel, said, this is too emotional, yes? And then a colleague of mine in Nuremberg, he published it last year in his yearbook of his research institute. But then I learned again how important it was to collect the experiences from the children, because they no, in this case, not from the children, because they were not yet interviewed, but about children, how family members desperately tried to push up the door handles when the terrorists wanted to enter, because the safe rooms, they are to protect from rockets, but not when there's an infiltration from Gaza. And then we connected to people who made a small documentary about what happened to children. There was a journalist who interviewed some children, and we connected to the medical staff of the Schneider Children's Medical Center, who received the children from Gaza captivity who were kidnapped with their families. And there was an Israeli researcher who then in the end interviewed the children after they were released from Gaza. And this will be published soon in a nice book about child rehabilitation from the Holocaust to 7th of October. It's out in March. Agnieszka also contributed with a chapter on the Warsaw Ghetto and the children. So to make a long story short, children's testimonies or experience what was done and happened to children, in this case from 2023 until today, is another chapter which in writing history. And I just started my habilitation project on German Jewish childhood from the 1920s to 1945 at Potsdam University. And the main sources for the analysis are ego documents, even though my original idea was because I wanted to understand how the hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism started back then, but now I have the problem I cannot that well concentrate on this issue because it's relevant today. Yeah, and there are some also children's or interview projects in Germany where Jewish children today are interviewed, they experienced this after and on 7th of October. Okay, so thank you very much. I was too long, I think.
No, you are perfect on time because we are just getting punctually to the first panel. And, well, to make the atmosphere here in the conference room less formal, I'd like to ask all our speakers just to introduce yourself by yourselves, okay? While before you start your presentations, and one important task: brief answer to the question: why did you decide to work on this specific topic, or more general, like children's history or histories? What brought you to your research projects? And now we are going to start the very first panel, which will be moderated by Agnieszka Witkowska-Krych, who is going also to contribute as a speaker to the panel. So this is an interesting mixture. Agnieszka, please, I'd like to invite you here in front of us. Verena Laubinger, I wouldn't say an old friend of mine, but we've known each other already for quite a long time. And Nehama, Grenimann-Bauch, is also asked to come here, or she's going to talk online. Okay, so. Okay. Shalom, hi, how are you? And well, I'm glad to invite all of our speakers to the table. Agnieszka, you are taking over. Verena, please take a seat. And Nehama is with us online. Thank you. Okay, perhaps the very last thing. I said that we are going to make the atmosphere in the conference less formal, except for one thing. So please stick to the time, 20 minutes, well, not about 20 minutes for your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction at the beginning. Thank you for having me here. I should say a few words about myself and also confess why I decided to work with the topic of the children. And actually it all started when I was 12. And when I watched the movie devoted to Janusz Korczak. And actually half of my life, more than half of my life, I was dealing with the children, with the Jewish children, with the history of the Jewish children, with the emphasis on the Jewish orphans. But actually, I had some more, let's say, maybe less emotional facts are that I graduated from the University of Warsaw. I also defended my PhD there at the University of Warsaw. Now I work in the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw, and I'm very glad that I'm here with you today. So let me just start my presentation. I should rather turn a little bit in order to see what is going on. Can I ask Pan Marek for help? And let me just see if it works and how. Yes. So hopefully I will be able to do it by myself. So my today's lecture is too big word, but my today's talk will will be devoted to the voices of special group of children, actually to the voices of the orphans that were imprisoned in. Here you see that we are dealing with the group that is crossing children as orphans, people who were living in the conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto that were far away from normal, and who were also located in the institutions. After Erwin Goffman, I should say that those were total institutions, but that were located in the institutions of care, that were providing them place to sleep, lodging, so to say, some kind of educational program, and also like full care, let's say. But let me just come back to the Warsaw Ghetto and remind you a little bit. Oh, it's not working, it is. So let me just come back to the Warsaw Ghetto, to this strange, peculiar space continuum of the Jewish residential area in Warsaw that was established, so to say, on the 16th of November 1940, and that lasted for exactly 30 months, so 2.5 of a year. So you've got the map in the middle of this slide. For those who know Warsaw, it's easy to locate it, but for those who don't know Warsaw, you have to believe me that it's in the very center of the city. And the Palace of Culture of Science, that probably you know how it looks like, the present from Stalin, from post-war present from Stalin, is nowadays located on the southern border of the previous Warsaw Ghetto. So you understand that it was located in the very, very middle of the city and divided or not divided into two parts, the upper part, the northern part, the bigger part, and the smaller part on the south. And it had some consequences. We are not going to speak about it today, but let me just tell you that the area of the Warsaw Ghetto was 3 square kilometers, and the number of people who were imprisoned there were approximately, at the peak, 450,000 people. So if you do some mathematical calculations, you can easily understand that for 1 square kilometers, there were more than 150,000 people. It's very difficult to imagine, but please think about your own room at home and put 10 people in your room. That's more or less the density. That's more or less the density. And the number of the children in the Warsaw Ghetto can be estimated around 100,000 children, but of course everything depends on the definition. Who is a child? Who should be defined as a child? Whether a 7-year-old smuggler who supports his family is still a child, or what to say about the 15-year-old person who is still under the care of an orphanage or another institution. So there is always this difficult question how to define the childhood also at that time. But we are going to speak about, hopefully we are going to speak about the orphanages, and please have a look on the map that I made myself. The map of the orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto. I decided to show it to you in order to somehow underline the fact that we've got this symbolic figure of Janusz Korczak. We know his heroic last act of being with the children till the last moment, but please bear in mind that he was not the only one, first of all, and his institution was not the only institution of full care that was existing in the Warsaw Ghetto. I spent years on researching this topic, and eventually I ended up with more than 20 orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in each and every of such institutions, there was some kind of Korczak, or the leader, or the director, who did exactly the same. So it will be good to widen the horizon somehow. Of course, it's somehow understandable that we remember about him precisely because he was already famous before the war, and his, let's say, educational methods were somehow unique or even too modern for that time. But still, it should be remembered that many teachers, educators, workers, social workers followed his steps. But coming back to Korczak and his ideas, for those who read Polish, that's going to be easy to understand the topic and the title of the book. But it's a beginning, actually, because that's the beginning where we can find the moment when teachers, adults, educators are very much interested in the voice of the children. This is the book that was published at the beginning of the 30s. It's called Wspomnienia z maleńkości, the memoirs from the childhood. And those are the voices of the children collected in the orphanage co-directed by Korczak. That was actually Polish orphanage. The main director was Maria Falska. What they did, they were sitting with the children and they were asking questions. Actually, they were opening the floor to speak, to free speech, because the children were telling the stories about their childhood before they joined the institution. And everything was noted down, was scribbled down, then after it was published as a book, as a real book, without corrections, without editing, without all this stuff that changes the text. So they already understood that the voice or the history of the personal story of each and every orphan is valid and important. So that's the beginning, but let me go back to the Warsaw Ghetto. So 100,000 children, more than 20 orphanages, dozens of places of instant, short-term or long-term help, soup kitchens, common rooms, private and public collections of money and clothes, so many actions and initiatives that were undertaken in order to help the children in the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, the net of this institution is quite complicated. We are not going to delve into it. There is a book about it. So if you want, you can have a look on it. It's my book, actually. It's not perfect, but actually we can understand how complicated this net was and how the situation was tremendous and difficult. Everything was underfinanced. Every director or every leader was trying to find funds to survive. And many of them also decided to document their work. And also many of them decided to document the voices of the children. But actually, those voices were here because the area of the Warsaw Ghetto and most of the buildings and first and foremost the people were killed. So it was very difficult to find any voices from there. Hic et nunc, we say in Latin. So, I mean, what we've got nowadays are only the scratches or only some traces that can lead us to the voice, personal stories of the children, of the orphaned children, who told their stories on their own. And while I'm speaking about the orphans, I have to underline also the fact that I understand orphan in Latin we say sensu largo, in this wide sense. Because what does it mean orphan nowadays? I mean, what did it mean at that time? Or what's the common understanding? Orphan is a baby or a child without parents. So it's a full orphan, actually, to be precise. But there were also semi-orphans or half-orphans and social orphans. And I mean, I take them all because, I mean, each and every voice of such child is important and crucial for me. But what can we have from such an area? That's the area of the Warsaw Ghetto after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Not much, but still we can find something. First of all, were the gazettes, like little journals, that were prepared and published within the premises of some of the institutions. And here we've got a gazette that was published in the orphanage for the older boys. And this orphanage was located on the street called Gęsia. And actually, we know that there were more issues of this gazette. This one survived among the documents that were collected by Emanuel Ringelblum, the historian of the Warsaw Ghetto, the one who decided to gather the documents and somehow protect them for the future generations. So we've got this gazette, one issue only, and it's really important to understand that it was prepared from the very beginning till the very end by those boys from this orphanage. And it was not, they were not forced to do that. They decided to express themselves because they wanted. And actually there was a reason for that. And in this gazette, in this issue, we can read about it. There was a crisis in this institution. Some of the oldest boys were expected to leave in order to make some space for the newcomers. They were not willing to leave because of obvious reasons. And there was a big quarrel among the children who were there earlier and the new ones who were supposed to come there for the next years. And here in this issue, we've got this anatomy of conflict between the children, between the charges of this institution, and it's extremely interesting to understand how they are trying to protect their rights to stay in the place. As an interesting fact, I can tell you that two of those boys survived. One of them was Marian Bafilis. His text was published here, and the other one was Shmuel Gogol, who was famous in Israel after the Second World War, because before he was in this institution located on Gęsia, he was at Korczak's orphanage, and at Korczak's orphanage he was given a mouth harmonica, Mundharmonika. That's the name in German? Okay. Mapuchit in Hebrew. Nehama, do you agree? So he was given this mouth harmonica, and when the liquidation started and this very home was also being evacuated, so to say, he ended up in Auschwitz and he was playing in the orchestra in Auschwitz. He survived Auschwitz, and with this mouth harmonica experience, he established a mouth harmonica orchestra in Israel. So his text is here in this very gazette. So we've got material like this, so like internal gazette, internal journal that was published by the children for the children from the institution. Another type of document that survived is a letter from the Korczak's orphanage. On the left side, you've got two pictures. The first one, the most left, is the original building of the orphanage of Janusz Korczak. If you are in Warsaw and you have got a lot of time, you can visit it, because this building survived. It was not included in the ghetto, so maybe that was the reason. But when the ghetto was established, the whole institution was forced to move to the ghetto, and they moved to this other building that was unfortunately destroyed. And from this second building comes the letter that you can have a look on. It's a letter of a girl who is greeting Korczak after his release from the prison. So this letter was written there in November 1940. That's the letter that depicts and somehow reflects on the actual situation in the orphanage. We don't have many of such documents. It's really, really unique. And another thing is a collection of memoirs of the children. You remember I was speaking about those memoirs from childhood or toddlerhood. So they never stopped collecting such memoirs. And even in the Warsaw Ghetto, they were trying to speak with the children, especially with the newcomers, with the resettlers or the refugees, the children of the refugees who ended up in this orphanage, and they were collecting their personal stories. So there is, we don't know how many of them they collected. We know that 24 of them survived. We have access to them, and actually what is important is the fact that they were not asking questions. They just gave the floor to the child, to the particular child, and asked him or her to tell his or her story. So there is no structure. It's a stream of consciousness, I would say. There's a lot of repetitions. When you read it now, it's like, it's very messy, so to say. But still, it's real, it's natural, it's the real voice of a child that was interviewed. we've got only 24 that survived with the collection of documents from Korczak's orphanage with his diary and some other documents. But it's more than possible that there were more of such short stories of the children. And now another source, which is a little bit peculiar because it's a licensed gazette that was published for the prisoners of the ghettos in the general government. It was called the Jewish Gazette, Gazeta Żydowska. And in this Gazeta Żydowska, apart from propaganda articles, there were some reportages from different places. And also here we've got an example of a reportage from one of the orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's a reportage written by a journalist, kind of a journalist. And of course, we cannot say that's one-to-one. What the child said, she wrote, and it was published. Probably not. But still, as we don't have much more, we have to somehow rely on this. And here we've got the word of a little girl who was asked if she's okay in this institution, if she's fine, how she feels, and so on. And there's her answer, quoted literally, or let's hope published literally. And as we don't have more, we have to at least use it as a source that can be trusted somehow. But there is another thing, and let's hope that I will not cry in this moment, but I've already told you that we are speaking about scratches. We don't have much, but we've got one thing that makes us thrilled somehow. And again, it's quoted relata refero, so not exactly. It's quoted, it's used as a part of someone's memoir. It's a memoir of one of the teachers, one of the educators, who was working in CENTOS, Central Organization for Help to the Orphans and Abandoned Children. His name was Józef Gitler-Barski. He survived. And after the war, he wrote a kind of a book or memoirs about his life and work in the Warsaw Ghetto. And here, he is writing about the last moments of one of the last orphanages of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he quotes the last, very last, and the only one known sentence on one of the children who were there. And that's the sentence. And he quotes it in Yiddish, so I will read it in Yiddish, and that's going to be very easy for you to understand. Ich will nicht sterben. And that's the sentence that stays with us. And that's the legacy that stays with us. And that's the task also to stay with us. And hopefully this conference and other conferences that are devoted to the children's voices and children's experience will help us to remember about this unknown by name boy. And he will not die due to us and thanks to us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my name is Verena Laubinger. I'm a teacher. I'm living in Göttingen, Lower Saxony, and I also teach at the University of Göttingen. And I defended my PhD in Gießen, actually at the beginning of this year. And it was about the history of experience in school books. And about the years 39 to 49, and the focus was on the German-Polish history. Yeah, and I present some results of my studies. I would like to begin with two quotes. They are taken from the diary of the 14-year-old Rivka Lipschitz. At that time, Rivka was in the Łódź Ghetto, the second largest ghetto after the Warsaw Ghetto. One day she writes in her diary, "I can't take it anymore, I have no strength left." These lines convey the great effort required by life in the ghetto, the departure from normal life, exhaustion and despair. Alongside this, there are quotes like the next one, which shows other aspects of everyday life. So the second, we found out something very ugly about Manya. She copied poems from books and pretended they were her own. Very ugly. I plan to write her a letter. Here, Rivka is clearly disappointed that Manya was insincere and she wants to talk to her about it. Both quotes, despite the differences, raise questions about why and how personal documents from children and young people should be used in educational media. In my talk, I would like to address three aspects. Educational media function according to their own rules. So firstly, I will start with some introductory remarks about the structure of educational media, what elements they consist of, and about the didactic principles they are based on. Secondly, I will talk about problematic points that I have noticed, where educational media still have gaps or blind spots. When it comes to usage of ego documents, there are two pitfalls I want to show you. Pitfall 1, perspectives of young people as emotional access. And pitfall 2, perspectives of young people transferring narratives which are problematic. Then, of course, I would also like to show you some successful examples. In this case, I will talk about visual ego documents. The fundamental purpose of education media is to contribute to the education of young people. In recent years, history didactics has presented various models and concepts relating to skills, historical thinking, and historical education. Scholars of history didactics, Martin Lücke and Irmgard Zündorf, formulate, historical learning is the productive, stubborn appropriation of past realities as self-narrated or self-imagined story. In this definition, historical learning is understood as an individual and individualized process. The attribute stubborn or self-willed takes up Alf Lütge's coinage of the term Eigensinn, stubbornness. Like historical actors, today actors perceive situations and social conditions through the lens of their individual interests. As research on the concept of Eigensinn has also emphasized, this can happen with and against the interests of those in power. Quality criteria for education in media. Narrativity is a quality criterion for education in media. The status quo before and after an event must be told. In addition, clear spatial concepts and concrete location information are required for accurate narration. Students must be offered both identification and distancing opportunities. Productive appropriation includes empathy, reflection, and experiences of otherness. There are two sides, to offer narratives, but also to break them up with personal documents and create openness to interpretation. In history didactics, openness to interpretation is covered by the term plurality. The objects must be presented in such a way that they allow for different plausible interpretations. The students' self-willed appropriation means that their specific multiple affiliations help determine their questions about history and contribute significantly to the individual constitution of meaning, it is to individual narratives and imaginations. In addition, different research opinions on controversially discussed topics should be included. Yes. The distinguishing characteristic of German history school books is that they comprise a series of elements rather than a single text. The blue one. And these elements collectively constitute the narrative. it is imperative to inquire into the relationship between the text composed by the textbook authors and the sources. Do the sources merely replicate the statements found in the author's text, or do they offer any unique insights or perspective? This talk does not provide a systematic overview of German education and media. Rather, I selected textbooks from the major German textbook publishers. I will use these textbooks to highlight important trends. I assumed there might be some personal documents about the Holodomor or the beginning of the war in 1939. I didn't find any. This is an interesting observation. There are no such personal documents from the 1930s in German school textbooks as far as I can see. In the following, I will therefore talk about personal documents from the 1940s. This drawing, you can see, was created in 1944 or 45 in Ravensbrück concentration camp. It shows two people standing on a small island, happily waving. Their gesture expressed joy and warmth, suggesting a strong bond of friendship. Surrounding the island, however, there are several sharks circling in the water, creating a sense of danger and isolation. This contrast between the cheerful figures and the threatening environment makes the image especially powerful. The style of the drawing, with its simple lines and almost playful depiction of people and animals, gives the impression that it is a child's artwork. How is the drawing used in the school book? The caption reads, "Our Island," and the folding card was a gift from Květa Hlinkova, who was born in Prague, to Ilse Hunger, who came from Leipzig. The double page is a page on which suggestions for further projects are given on the left, and on the right you can check what you have learned. The drawing is very appealing and very positive in the hope it expresses. The explanation does not make clear that Květa Hlinkova is an artist, nor it is clear that she was in her mid-20s when she drew this card for her friend. So what we see here is that the textbook publishers are using materials that are not painted by children, although they may be read as such. On these pages, and also on the previous pages about Ravensbrück concentration camp, children are not mentioned at all, nor are the issues of dealing with violence and the importance of friendship addressed. The drawing greatly enriches the chapter on Ravensbrück, but without the context information needed. The potential pitfall therefore lies in the following aspect. This symbolic representation, read as a processing mode of children, distracts from the question of how the perpetrators were able to carry out the violent acts. The next example discusses how Poles behaved towards Germans in 1945. Firstly, we will examine the author's text by analyzing the example from History and Events, a schoolbook from 2014. After briefly characterizing the German occupation of Poland between 1939 and 45, the textbook authors turn to its end of the occupation and write about the Polish population. Quote, "Many hoped to be able to live in freedom again. However, quite a few also wanted to take revenge on those who had previously deprived them of their rights and treated them brutally." Unquote. The authors only distinguish between a love of freedom and revenge. Other aspects are not mentioned, the desire of justice, for the restoration of the victim's dignity, for a new beginning, for which the Germans' possessions were a fundamental basis, and the functionalization of hatred by the communists. In the presentation of freedom on the one hand and revenge on the other, the moral impetus lies with freedom. The authors of other school textbooks also do little to elaborate on the motives. The fact that the idea of ethnic homogeneity also played a central role in expulsion is generally emphasized, thus relativizing the image of vengeful Polish population. The material sections provide a much more differentiated approach than the author text discussed so far. At the same time, the narrations tend to contrast the vengeful Poles with the empathic Poles, even in these sections. In this context, it's very striking that education and media producers primarily use sources that reflect the perspective of children and young people. And here now the quote. A Pole who experienced the forced resettlement of Germans as a child in Neustädtin, Szczecinek, in May 1945 recalled, "For the first time we witnessed Germans being driven out of their homes. This was done by a few civilians with carabines and white and red armbands. We guessed that it was our militia. Was this supposed to be revenge for what the Germans had done to us Poles during the war years? Was pushing around 2 old women and 1 old man supposed to bring us satisfaction?" Like the personal account of the expulsion of Germans from Neustädtin, 3 other personal accounts offer the experiences of children at that time, so the memoirs, which were formulated as memoirs. If one of the 3 personal accounts does not mention any middle-aged German adults at all and only contains stories of victims, Polish victims and German victims of war, this is a simplistic interpretation of German-Polish relation in the period after the German occupation. In contrast, the collective knowledge is presented in a much more complex way in another document, which states that it took time of living together until the ice of mistrust was broken, but that not all Poles had renounced violence. However, none of the sources address the persecution of the German perpetrators and public satisfaction. It asks the questions of law and justice. So, next example. These were my observations concerning collective knowledge so far. The source I'm going to discuss next is something completely different. It's a photograph from the DP camp in Brunel, Bavaria. It was taken in May 1947 by Tony Vaccaro, a well-known photographer in the American services. The caption reads, "Displaced persons, children deported to Germany, wait to be repatriated to their home country." What is particularly striking about this photo is how different the children and young people look. Their faces are very individual, and as are their postures and what they are wearing. Images have 3 functions in German remembrance culture to this day. They are interpreted as symbols, icons, or sources. Images function as a symbol when they represent narratives. An image or sequence of images is perceived as a narrative pattern to which a generally known and recognized meaning is attributed. The photograph on the left-hand side serves as a symbol. It illustrates the narrative of the Germans' desperate flight in the winter of 1945. In German remembrance culture, the icons of destruction, such as the gatehouse of Auschwitz, represents an identification of this symbolic function of images. Through the canonization of a few images of horror, German crimes were positioned beyond everyday life. The crimes thus appeared detached from social realities, collective knowledge, and the mental strategies of the perpetrators. This photograph of the displaced children, on the other hand, works differently. It raises questions about the individual experiences. Here on this page, there is no space, or the authors didn't use any space for further information about displaced children, but from the perspective of presenting individual experiences, it is very positive that the textbook publishers have included this photo on the page. Last example, this portrait shows Stanisława B., who was born in 1926 in Kalisz district. At the time the photograph was taken, she was a teenager. She calmly looks at the viewer. The photograph was presumably not taken under external pressure. Personal attributes catch the eye: a floral blouse and earrings. Her hair is carefully styled. Stanisława's face has no sharp or angular features. It appears authentic and intimate. However, Cornelia Brink pointed out as early as in 1999 that also private photographs are subject to convention, and that when these photographs are used in a public context, in a textbook, they promise authenticity and privacy, but privacy remains empty, as the person depicted has no personal relationship with the viewer. The photograph therefore needed time for reflection. Here I can show you how it's used on this page in the school book. The textbook authors didn't include more information about this girl, unfortunately, but they talk about the experiences about the topic of parenthood during forced labor. The experience is not limited to the mother, but is described for both parents. Individual perspectives are considered. In an excerpt from a letter, a Polish woman articulates the lifelong damage caused by a lack of care to children born during forced labor. What is striking in both cases, the photo and the letter, is the individual perspective and the reference point of lost normality. Now my conclusions. This presentation has shown that ego documents from children and young people can enrich education and media by offering emotional access and specific perspectives on war and genocide. However, their use must be critically examined. One striking observation is the absence of ego documents from the 1930s in German history schoolbooks referring to war and genocide. Events such as the Holodomor or the outbreak of war in 1939 are not presented through personal testimonies. In contrast, materials from the 1940s are more common but often problematic. Drawings are presented as having been made by children, even when they were created by adults. For example, Kvetelnikova's drawing from Ravensbrück is presented as a child's artwork, although she was in her mid-20s. Supposed children's perspectives serve as symbolic representation of violence without further explanations. Similarly, childhood memories of the expulsion of Germans in 1945 are used to legitimize simplified narratives on Polish revenge without addressing broader motives such as justice, pragmatism, or political manipulation. Despite these pitfalls, ego documents offer valuable opportunities for more nuanced representations. They allow learners to engage with history through individual stories. Education and media should therefore contextualize ego documents carefully, balancing emotional engagement with historical complexity. They must avoid using childhood perspectives to reinforce moral dichotomies or national narratives. Instead, they should promote multiperspectivity, empathy, and critical reflection. This approach supports productive historical learning and encourages students to ask their own questions about justice, identity, and memory. Thank you.
Now I pass the floor to Nehama, I guess. So we need some help switching.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And now.
Because I just disconnected in the last second.
Okay, it's fine.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, we can see you.
Oh, you can't. Okay, I can't hear you. Okay.
We can hear you, we can see you. Everything is
Perfect.
perfect.
I'll try to share my slide. Someone needs to open it up for me to share my slides. Doesn't allow it. Okay. Let's see, I can share. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay. Can you tell me if you see the slides, see me, and hear me?
We can hear you, we can see you, your slide is clearly visible.
Perfect. Fantastic. So I'm Nehama, Grenimann-Bauch. Nice to meet you, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I do actually live in Berlin, but I'm in Israel at the moment visiting my family. I'm originally from Jerusalem. And yeah, it is a holiday here, so unfortunately I don't think I'll manage to stay much beyond after your lunch break, although it's very fascinating, so I'm sorry I can't do that, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you, but it's been a pleasure watching your presentations. I am not a historian, I'm an art therapist, and I'm just finishing my PhD about art therapy with refugees. I literally, about 2-3 weeks ago, sent in my final dissertation, and I'm waiting for the defense. So that's where I am at right now. Like I said, I'm from Jerusalem. I studied art and set design in Florence. I did my master's in Haifa University in Israel, where for my master's, I researched on the topic of fathers and mentalization, which I can explain briefly, maybe if we have time, and using clay for an intervention with fathers. I worked in various international projects. I've been living in Berlin for the past 11 years, and around more than 7 years, I worked with children from migrant backgrounds. Primarily, I worked with refugees, but not only, also children at risk in Berlin. I stopped a few years ago to focus on my research that was on the topic of my work. I also did some psychosocial and mental health consultancies, and I teach on related topics. As you were speaking, I added this image because I don't know how to briefly answer the question, what brought me to the research that I did. This is my grandmother, me with my grandmother. So she was from Warsaw, and she was in the Warsaw Ghetto. She was actually a orphan or semi-orphan pre-war. Her father died after World War I, and she met Janusz Polczak. I wasn't going to mention this, but since it came up, I thought I would say it. She was, in an odd way, lucky because he told her that she should stay with, she was very clingy to her mother, and that's the story she told, that he told her she should stay with her mother, she needs her mother, and she ended up escaping to Russia and Siberia and was in DP camps. There's a long story. All my grandparents were refugees. My grandmother and my grandfather were Holocaust survivors. The other two were from Berlin and Austria and left in the 30s as children. But maybe just to say, it's not that straightforward. It's not that I woke up one day in Berlin and said, well, since my grandparents were refugees, I want to work with refugees. I didn't even consider them refugees because I didn't think of that as something in that direction. And as an immigrant myself, it just made sense to me, especially with waves of refugees coming in. It kind of happened that I was an art therapist that could work with different populations. So I'm still figuring that out, and we can have one day a long presentation about what the real deep reasons and how all my process of connecting these two. I'm sure everybody in the room knows what refugees are. I probably don't need to explain. So I brought here the United Nations General Assembly definition, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, political opinion, and is outside of their country or unable or, owing to such fear, unwilling to avail themselves of its protection. We're not going to get into this, but it also isn't such a simple definition. And more importantly, I worked with refugees and asylum seekers, with refugees having some acknowledged status, and that makes a difference for work with the children, because of course there's much more uncertainty with asylum seekers, where you don't know when you're working with them as a therapist if they're going to be there the next week when you come back, and that makes it much more complicated to plan or to do kind of the right thing by them. So that's the most important distinction that I can say from therapist side for me. As an art therapist, just as a quick definition, art therapy is a form of psychotherapy using art media as the primary mode of expression and communication, and it's used for to deal with emotional issues, less for diagnosing. We assess sometimes with artwork, we assess sometimes for research, but mostly it's to be used within the context of therapy and therapeutic goals. Sorry, it's working. Since maybe some of you who have done your doctorate can identify, since I just finished my doctorate, it was very hard to narrow down and think of the one specific thing I can bring up in 20 minutes. But I will, before I explain exactly what my research was and what part we're going to look at very briefly, generally I was looking at art therapy with refugees and digging very deep into this. Art therapy with refugees obviously happened long before 2015, when there was a surge of refugees primarily into Europe and Germany, but not only, of course, internally displaced. One forgets, but most asylum seekers and refugees worldwide today as well are mostly internally displaced. I mean, they're not refugees, but displaced children are mostly displaced within the country that they came from or in the neighboring country. Just to mention, art, not as art therapy, but as we just saw, art in the use of art with children who experienced war goes, I'm sure, way, way back before World War II, but we have some very strong experiences, examples of it in World War II. One famous example is Friedrich Brandeis, who was in Theresienstadt, where she worked with many, many children. I'm sure some of you are familiar. She's one of the more famous women who worked with children who did art during the Holocaust. Among them, one of the founders of art therapy in the U.S. Learned with her before the war. She escaped Austria, Edith Kramer, before the war, but it's very, very linked. So just to put that together. But since 2015, the times when I was working, I started focusing primarily and only on refugees in 2017-18. Generally speaking, art therapy kind of popped up as a very, it's been used more and more by NGOs and by different organizations, sometimes institutions, to work with children, refugees who have experienced war. There is more and more research about it. It's still very much at its beginnings. It's not, there are therapies that are more easily researched, like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or NET, narrative exposure therapy, which is very specific, very structured, and short in time, and it makes it easier to randomized control studies where you can find very specific outcomes, specific outcomes that you can say how it's good for refugee children. When it comes to art therapy, there are a lot of different kinds of ways of working with art therapy. There are different lengths of intervention, and it makes it harder to research. But generally, there have been some findings about improvement in well-being, less stress. There has been more and more emphasis on the importance of engaging parents in art therapy with their children, but that's been studied even less. And that is actually my topic of research. I said, unfortunately, I'm going to jump through it just to bring you an example, because that's what I want to bring you. But generally speaking, when we talk about art therapy that involves parents in general, not only with refugees, there are kind of three main ways that you can do that when you're doing therapy with a child. One is meeting separate with the child, so giving parental training, guidance, counseling, and you can use the artwork to show the parent what's happening with their child, of course, with the agreement with the child allows the parent to see the artwork. That aspect is very important, and also came up in my research by art therapists is very important. Another way to do it is working together, parent and child together, doing artwork together, reflecting together. Another way is through family art therapy that involves other members of the family as well. Otherwise, in most places, when I studied in Haifa University, it's kind of well acknowledged that it is essential to have the minimum amount of engaging parents when working with children. So at the very least, an opening meeting, a few sessions, a few meetings throughout, and then at the end. For many, many reasons, this often does not happen with refugees and asylum seekers. When, of course, there are those who don't have parents, and therefore you can't engage their parents. When they do have parents, there are so many aspects to consider that make it very, very difficult also to standardize how you work with parents and children in these circumstances. Some of the considerations that I would think of when working with the children would be, if both parents are there, one parent is there, did they separate during when they escaped on the way, for how long? Was the child born in the host country? All these things, and it's true also for historical documentation, I assume, are very important to consider, and there are many, many, many other aspects. However, I decided in my research to focus generally, not on only one specific country of origin, but generally on refugee children and parents, based on the assumption that there are some commonalities, there are some common experiences that they have that we can address through art therapy. I focus specifically on Western or mostly European host countries. I think there's quite a difference between that and between being in your country of origin internally displaced, but generally adjusting to the new host country and to new culture is an issue. Transitional aspects of transition from one thing to the other. Many, as you can see at the bottom, there are different numbers, but one statistic says 70% of refugee populations experience or witnessed, had experienced or witnessed violence. That's from a research. I think that's wrong. That's actually 2019. A lot of Syrian refugees in that research. Regardless of what specifically they experience, there's a loss of control and agency, both for parents and for children. And there are difficulties accessing mental health. I'm trying to remember what was mentioned, right? Verena, I think you said something about it being standard meeting with psychologists. I'm happy. I mean, I have the feeling that it does happen in Israel mostly, but with refugees that I worked with in Berlin, that was definitely not always the case. They don't always have access. Until they get access, they are talking about their situation, their trauma, and everything that's happening with other people who are not necessarily psychologists or therapists or art therapists. And of course, mostly parents have a lot of difficulties communicating with the schools and the kindergartens that are caring for their children. And often the children end up taking on the role of translators and the sort of more adult role, which is one of the commonalities that a lot of children in these situations have when they are escaping with their parents, kind of becoming more parent-like. So I'm going to skip through. I don't have a lot of time, but generally speaking, I was looking at this topic of engaging refugee parents with their children's art within their children's art therapy, and I looked at deliberately at several different samples. So I had focus groups with art therapists who worked with refugees and asylum seekers mostly from Germany, but also from other countries. And then I had a focus group with parents. I had worked in the past with Syrian, Iraqi, Irani, Afghani children. And I had Syrian, Afghani, and Sudanese parents in my focus group. It was a very small group. But when I moved forward to the more practical aspect of giving art-based workshops with refugee parents, the Ukrainian refugees came. So I ended up, I'm going to skip here just to show you, doing a few tryout workshops to see how, in what ways would it be acceptable and helpful to work with parents in this scenario. I did that with a sample of Ukrainian mothers and their children. I did 3 types of workshops. Just to ask whoever has the microphone there, I can't see you now. So do I have 5 more minutes? Because on my computer it says I have 5 more minutes, but I'm not sure if I have 2 minutes.
Yes.
5.
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll do what I can with 5. So I did 3 workshops. This was based also on my work experience and how I found a way to engage parents within my work. Also on literature, and also I had to be pragmatic about what I could do in research. And so this is not therapy, but it's kind of a little tryout to see what works for the parents and children, what's acceptable. And what I did in the first workshop was based on a little procedure, a kind of task developed by a professor that I know from Haifa University, Tami Gavron, who developed this task of parent-child joint painting, which is very specific. You'll see in a moment in the images. It's one very large piece of paper, and there are a few very specific tasks. The parent and the child, it's only a dyad, one parent, one child, draw a space for themselves on the paper, whatever shape they want, and then they draw whatever they want inside that space. And once they're done, they create frames around their shape, and then paths from one shape to the other. The final step is they draw or paint together in the space that is left. And there are a lot of, this is a way to look at the parent-child dynamic, to see what can help, usually at the beginning, middle maybe of therapy, to kind of help move forward with working on the relationship. Here, it was just a workshop, so we only had time to do this one thing. Usually they elaborate on their experiences and their feelings, and then they discuss it, the parent and child, together with the therapist. Here, it was a group of Ukrainian mothers and children together in the room, so they only got a chance to write a title for their drawing and a short story, and that's what I'm going to show you kind of last minutes. The other 2 workshops were, one was for parents only, so to try this aspect of what it's like to support the mothers on their own, and there was a psychoeducational aspect there to explain what the children might be going through, to talk about trauma, to kind of give a few tools for the mothers, and also to give a supportive space. And the third workshop combined parents and children, but in a group together, and that was actually the only place where the children had a chance to draw something on their own, not together with their mothers, and they had a chance to comment on it. But again, these were short workshops, so there wasn't a lot of elaboration, which has reason. I won't have time to go into all the aspects of what specific needs or specific background of Ukrainian refugees, but what's very clearly reflected in my research, I didn't choose to have only mothers, but only mothers is something that largely exists in Germany at the beginning when they were coming. Most of the men, the children in my research were mostly primary age school, and most of the men were stayed behind in Ukraine because they had no choice. And this is true in my research and true in general. There is a very, very high average educational level for various reasons that one can discuss of Ukrainian refugees specifically. Maybe they have more of the means. There is an emphasis on education. We can discuss this, but that was true with all the mothers in my research. I had 12 dyads, of which one was were twins, so 13 children. They were supposed to all go through all 3 workshops, but only 7 continued to the other workshops. In 2 minutes, what I want to do is just show you also how differently the children express themselves and without words kind of tell their story or share the story together with the parents. So this is a dyad. They're all anonymized. These are all names that I made up. The mother was between 35 to 45 years old, and the daughter was 7. You can see here what I was describing. They each made a shape. This would be an example of a pretty balanced joint painting, because they each left a large space for the other, and they kind of worked together, and there still is space in between. You see this in a process because they were the one dyad that didn't finish on time, so I don't have the final drawing. And I won't read everything again because I don't have time, but what's interesting, and I'll show you one more image, is that the name of the title was inspired by the name of a cat. And this is one of 3 children who mentioned cats. Where another example, this is another child, drew only a cat in the 3rd session. And no humans. I will show you one more image of a child who also didn't draw in humans. But interestingly, also when the children felt shy, naturally, they were online in this 3rd session, and they didn't feel comfortable speaking too much. They also didn't all speak German very well. But interestingly, what he did say was he has a cat, and it's so cool and comfortable, and he sits next to you and purrs, and so he drew the cat. But his mother, again in pseudonym, said, well, we just live here in a rented apartment, so we don't have a cat. And her son said, yeah, but we used to have one. And she said, well, that was at home. And that's not the only child who brought up a cat or an animal, or also people missing. But it was very interesting, and with that, I will kind of let you. I'm skipping over things, but if there's time for questions, you're welcome to ask me. Yeah, it's very quick to show you a few things. But this is another child that when he drew on his own, as you can see, there are no other humans at all. In this session, this 3rd session, also the child that drew a cat, they were asked to draw something that is safe for them, a space for them to draw or to do art therapy. And this child drew a house, and he also didn't speak much, but he described it as a large house with a big pool and a basketball field. And I'll use this image just to give you an idea of some of my findings of what came out of it. Since this was the 3rd session, after the 3rd session, the mothers were invited to reflect on it and to share the significant events in these different sessions, what felt helpful to them, more kind of comfortable, or maybe stressful. And this mother, who had a very positive bonding experience in the joint drawings, then she wrote afterwards that, I have it here, right? That's the second one, pseudonym Claudia. She said, while we were drawing the last pictures on the 3rd session, I noticed that maybe my requirements are too much, and trying to make my son's safety, I press too much and require too much, and too much ideals and perfectionism, too much my fears and scares. This was translated from Ukrainian. I had translators, and I transfer it to my son. Not deliberately, I assume is what she meant. And that's why this was, she wrote in German, Fenster, that's why there's windows with spears around his safe space. She only noticed that afterwards when she talked to him. So I'll stop the share. This aspect, for example, gave, I hope you all see me because I can only see myself. It gave the mother the chance to reflect in these 3 sessions were a very, very short process, but even in that short process for this mother, for example, and there was another mother that said that, there are other examples, it really gave the mother the empowerment, the agency, and the chance to to look at what the child is doing and reflect on their interaction and how she can help. So it's a very powerful tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nehama. It was very impressive, and I already have some questions, but before I ask them, I would like to give the floor to our audience, and please feel free to ask questions, and please, Verena, come to us. Yes, we'll be together, the panelists. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to raise them. Take a second. I will ask about, yes, there is, yes.
Okay. I got interested. Maybe I haven't just got it, but you have mentioned quite a few pictures, pieces of art with cats. Are there also some pictures with other animals, other pets, like dogs, for example? I don't know, goldfishes, or or only cats? Is it so typical? Because I found it personally quite interesting. Thank you.
I find it interesting as well. My sample was small. Like I said, I had 12 mothers and 13 children. So it's not representative or something that you can generalize as much as you can learn from it a little bit about clinical practice. I didn't see, there were there was a pumpkin with a face, there was a train and an airplane. I don't know if it represents, but I did find it interesting that the pets were there because mostly the pets did not join. So there were some that drew family or humans, and then you can only imagine that some of them are people they miss. But adding the cats or having only a cat was very interesting because it's kind of an aspect that they also thought about, and it was a way maybe to express certain things that can later be elaborated on. But it would be very interesting to find out if there are more animals in other drawings.
So let me ask a very simple or even simplistic question, but I'm also interested, I'm talking to Nehama, sorry, what media are used the most common? I mean, I saw like drawing pencils, wax or oil pencils. What else? I mean, maybe, yes. What do you use in your practice?
So I can divide that into my practice and my research. So in my practice, there's a variety, and there were different settings. I worked in a school and a shelter, but there's usually, I try to make sure there's a variety of materials and a kind of dialogue with the children to choose which materials. And one thing that's interesting, and I heard this also from others, that they were very drawn to clay. They really, really liked working. You don't see it there. You see it in my previous research, though, where I work with clay. But this aspect of clay was, for whatever reason, they were very drawn to it, making a mess, taking apart, putting back together. It's very powerful. I didn't have the ability in my research to bring an option of different materials, and the task is specifically supposed to be with paint, with tempera. But even that was a little hard to organize because we'd have to clean afterwards, and there was a whole group of people. So they only got the option of either pastels, oil pastels, or pencil, kind of water-soluble pencils. Yeah, so in my research, I can't say what the preference is, but in my clinical work, clay was one of the things they were very drawn to.
Thank you. There is a question from our audience.
Yes, I have a question to you, Agnieszka, because you also had a lecture earlier. Yes, I wanted to ask because how did these testimonies, I remember some years ago you said you were in search of these documents, and it was not so easy to find them. You didn't go to an archive and find them, that's it, yes? But I don't remember the story. And then I have a question to the other Verena. And as far as I understood it right, you use in your educational materials documents, ego documents, to teach about war and genocide. And how can you manage the challenge to explain, or do you explain the difference between war and genocide? Because I think from the perspective of those who were the, what are the Betroffene? Not the victims, but from the people who lived through it. German children in bomb shelters, experienced Allied bombings. But on the other hand, Jewish children who were hunted after and potentially should die. And to Nehama, I have the question because you said in your interviews, you said, are the parents reflected on I project or push or whatever, put my own problems onto the children. And I know from my own research, it was child survivors from Jewish child survivors from Bergen-Belsen. I mean, it was decades later when I interviewed them, but they said, I know you have to critically discuss the sources, but they said, we didn't understand what was going around us because, of course, today we know there was mass extermination, but we played, we counted the dead bodies and learned how to count and all these things. And parallel to this, these children learned the parents are not available and so on, but this is different, obvious, today in your work because you have this parent-child therapy. And do the parents sometimes, or the mothers, I assume, reflect on this, that they change something in their relationship to their children and so on? I don't know, it's maybe a little bit complicated, the question. Yes?
Shall we start from Nehama? Maybe that was the first question directed to, so maybe we'll go this way.
As long as you remember the question, sure. I'll try to. There were different, it was very hard for me, like I said, this is the first presentation I gave after sending in my dissertation, so it's very hard to summarize so much that is in my doctorate, and there were various things that I saw, kind of insights of the parents. And one of the very interesting things actually among the parents were also without words. So in the joint paintings, some aspects, again, I cannot know for sure, and in some cases I can tell by what the mother said afterwards. In other cases, there's less information. But one of the things we can see in the joint paintings is what happens when they draw the frame and the path. I don't see these things as like, it's not a one-to-one. I'm not diagnosing and saying this is for sure, but it's interesting to see some of the mothers made very, very thick frames. And some of the children with them almost didn't have frames at all. And some of the interactions kind of gave the feeling that the mothers were looking for space for themselves, and they were trying to kind of really, different from what they probably experienced and had in real life, because they were living in very small, small apartments or conditions where they're with their child all the time, trying to give as much as they can to their child. But in the drawing, it kind of indicated that they're really trying to have space for themselves, and the child is the one that's looking for more and more kind of connection. So, you can dive very deep into it, but beyond what they said, there was also what one can see, and that would be a very interesting thing to open up or to use in practice to really discuss these differences and needs. I hope that answers a little bit.
Thank you. Verena, will you please?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I started thinking about it, how I taught the lessons. I I have two answers. The first one is often in education and media, the story of the Shoah is treated, I think, too narrow. So, for example, there is a line, you see a ghetto, and then there is the next step to annihilation. So the ghetto, the next step to annihilation, and before you start understanding what is going on in the ghetto, how is everyday life, before you read ego documents. So the first step is to go into it, to everyday life in ghetto, and therefore the two quotes in the beginning of my talk, you have really heavy quotes, like emotional quotes, and then other quotes about everyday life and conflicts, and a girl of 14. And this is the one answer. And the other thing is that, as always, you need time to teach. So you should have some lessons to talk about how was the occupation in Poland, what meant this for the Jewish people, what meant it for the non-Jewish people, what did the Germans occupiers there. So the context, you need time to explain and to imagine the context, and I think it's very good to have specific localities. So Łódź, my father was born in Łódź as a German, so I took Łódź as an example for how was life in the 1920s and in the 1930s, and what changed when the Germans came in. And so you have to teach, I think you have to teach concrete situations, and then the differences became clear, but I also think that different questions, you have two lessons and want to explain what was the experience of Shoah, or what did it mean to be Jewish, or to ask the question, am I Jewish, and how does it feel? So it's not easy to solve these questions, but yeah, it must be concrete. I think that's the point. Mm-hmm.
So about the sources that Verena asked, I'm afraid that I'm constantly looking for the sources. Although the doctorate is defended, the book is published, and I felt that I'm not dealing with the orphaned children anymore, especially after having my own one at home. It's very difficult to deal with the topic when you've got your own one at home. But I'm constantly looking for some, I don't know what, confirmations of my reflections, or maybe something that will make this research more complicated even. So, of course, the sources that are still waiting to be researched entirely, but it requires a lot of time, is the visual history archives. You have to sit and listen and watch and make notes, and it's so time consuming, and you need time for that, time and space. I mean, you cannot read it like a book in a tram or in a whatever, or in a plane. You have to sit and you have to make notes. So I think that it still awaits me, actually, but I don't know if I've got enough strength, like internal strength, to deal with the topic of the children now. So I don't know, maybe I will have to switch a little bit. So, and there is still some hope, or there is possibility that some of the documents were not revealed yet. So the third part of the Ringelblum's archive, which is said that it was hidden somewhere, never found. We are all waiting for this revelation, but actually we don't know if it ever existed. So there is this big question mark that is accompanying us. It's, I mean, and it's like a general statement. It's very difficult to say that we've done what was, I mean, possible to be done. I mean, there's always those little spaces, places that could have been researched, like little archives, even in Israel, that I haven't researched all of them. Yad Vashem and Beit Lahamei Hagatot, it's more or less covered, but there are some smaller places. Also in Poland, I mean, you should have like 7 lives, like a cat, in order to be sure that you've seen everything with your own eyes. But there's a hope, I mean, there is this, you know, there is this clear path ahead of us, that there's always something to be done, and it's somehow optimistic. So, do we have any more questions to our panelists?
Agnieszka, if I may, I am very eager to know, to discover from you about the co-educational aspect of these orphanages in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. Do you know something about it? I mean, were most of these institutions homes where girls and boys were risen up together, or maybe sometimes not, sometimes otherwise?
Normally the sexes were separated. Normally there were for boys or for girls, and that was quite normal. Actually, at the age of 7, they were separating boys from girls. Earlier, sometimes they were connected, but in case of Korczak's orphanage, they decided, I mean, Korczak and his closest co-worker, working partner Stefania Wilczyńska, and the association called Relief for the Orphans, Towarzystwo Pomoc dla Sierot, they decided that they are going to have boys and girls together because life and world looks like this. Boys and girls normally live together. So, I mean, there's no. Yes. It was possible for them because they were independent from the state, independent from the Warsaw municipality, and independent from the Jewish community. They were somehow, they were only dependent on the funds that were collected by the association called Towarzystwo Pomoc dla Sierot, Relief for the Orphans. So they could have implemented their own methods, like joining the sexes, boys and girls, and implementing the basics of democracy in the institution, and implementing something which I would call self-government or the court of peers and stuff like this. In other institutions, it was rather impossible, or, I mean, it was not such a common solution, I would say. Yeah. Do we have more questions? Any more questions? I've got a question to both of our panelists, to Nehama and to Verena. How you are emotionally prepared to do your work? Do you've got like your own preparations, like courses, therapy, whatever? Because I can imagine and I can see it among my colleagues that it's a burden. I mean, you are working with a very difficult topic, and you are working with children or refugees, and it's, I mean, it demands from you also some kind of strength, internal strength, how to keep it and how to, yes, that's the question. Verena, will you start, please? Because I want to get rid of the microphone.
A difficult question. When you asked the question, I started thinking about my students. So I think that's an answer, that I imagine what's interesting for them and what are their experiences, because I have many students who came from Syria, Afghanistan. So, and I think you need. I need the openness. How the lesson goes on, but I think the ego documents are very positive and very hopeful, powerful. Yeah, and therefore I started my research on this, and I also teach often about ego documents because it's so human. That's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I can identify definitely when I was working. It's been a few years now that I've been focusing on research. When I was working with the children's reaction, it's fun. It's the word fun comes up because it's fun to work with children. Art therapy is usually perceived by them as a nice hour. They're really excited, so the excitement can be, contagious. And I obviously like what I do. So in the research, it's maybe a little more complicated. The parents were very positive, and that was very strengthening to hear that they appreciated participating and that they wanted to share. But of course, on a personal level, it's a much longer, lifelong journey, and it became more complicated since the 7th of October. I think various people deal with it differently. I started with distancing, and in the past 2 years, feel more and more the need to work with my own community, which I did less in the past. So that's a journey I'm trying to explore and discover. And art, using art, that's my field.
Thank you very much. Thank both of you for your lectures and the answers. Thank you, our audience. And I hope that this session will leave something in your hearts and will help you to deal with your own challenges in your private and professional life. Thank you very much.